We talked last time about God's provision of manna for the people of Israel as they had escaped from Egypt and were waiting for the next thing that God was going to have for them. And he provided this food that they were to gather every morning, only enough for that day, and that would sustain them. And we saw that some of them thought that they knew better than God, and so they gathered extra, and it basically rotted, and so it was useless. And we just discovered that God's ways are best, even when they don't entirely make sense to us, or when we think that we have a better plan. But as you go on in that story, you see that God gave some specific instructions for the Sabbath, because the Sabbath was to be a day of rest. And so the people were instructed not to go out on the Sabbath morning and gather their manna, but rather on the day before, they were to gather twice as much. And this is from Exodus 16, starting in verse 22. Now on the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, then he said to them, "This is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." So they put it aside until morning as Moses had ordered, and it did not become foul, nor was there any worm in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none." It came about on the 7th day that some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you bread for 2 days on the 6th day. Remain every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. And in this passage, again, we see people who are thinking, my way is better. I know God said gather twice as much, but I'm an early riser. I want to go out and gather fresh food tomorrow. And they presumed on God's generosity. They presumed on God's provision rather than obey God's commands. And so when they went out on the 7th day, they were surprised to find that there was nothing. But those who had obeyed and gathered twice as much and did what God had commanded them had food for the Sabbath day that didn't rot like it did if you gathered extra on any of the other days. You see, the people of Israel, like us, need to learn that God's ways are best and that God means what he says. The Bible is not sort of a buffet where we get to pick and choose what we agree with. It's God's instructions for us about how to have a right relationship with him, how to live in right relationship with others. And so I would pray that we would be people who wouldn't presume on God's provision, who wouldn't say, you know what, I can do things my way and somehow God will work it all out. It will still come out all right in the end. Sometimes we take verses like Romans 8:28 and we misuse them. That verse says that we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, for those who are called according to his purposes. And sometimes we get that in our mind that if I don't follow biblical principles for finance, that's okay, because in the end, God's going to work all things together for good. If I don't follow biblical principles for my relationship with my family members, it's all right, because God's going to work it all out in the end. That verse is not a verse that says, go ahead and do whatever you want. You have carte blanche, and then God is going to work it all out. That verse is in the context of us being obedient, and that even difficult things will work out for our good. Just as the release from Egypt, doing things God's way, was working out for the benefit of the Israelites. So I would encourage you today to just take a little inventory of your life and think about, is there a part of my life? Is there a place in my life, or is there a situation in my life where I am presuming on God's goodness and his provision? Is there a place in my life where I have decided to do things my own way because I will just trust that somehow God's going to work it out? The Bible says that God uses all kinds of things, even our sinful decisions. But it doesn't say that we're exempt from the consequences. And just like these people went out on the Sabbath day and discovered that there was nothing there for them, when we willingly choose to disobey God, we may suffer consequences for that. God can still use it in our life. He can use it for our good and his glory. But how much better to follow God's instructions in the first place and to rest in his provision and his goodness, but not presume upon it.